pleasure to welcome to our program today. Woman who will be speaking is part of the Forum Truth series. We always enjoy talking to the speakers that come through. She'll be in town on April 14th. That's a Wednesday, 7:30 at the Holly Hall. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Linda Greenhouse, who has covered the Supreme Court for New York Times for many years, and she'll be speaking about the Roe versus Wade, before and after that particular case, which has been kind of a galvanizing case for so many years. We're joined now by Linda Greenhouse. Hi, Linda. How are you?
I'm fine, Doug. Thanks for having me on.
It's good to talk to you, and good to have a chance to talk a little bit about something I guess a lot of people really don't really understand fully, is the Supreme Court. Have you found that in your coverage of that? A lot of people really don't know exactly what goes on in there, right?
Well, I think that's largely true, yeah. I mean, the court seems to speak in its own language, and it's not on television, and, sometimes it's here, and sometimes it's on recess for a long time. So, yeah, I think it's hard for most people to kind of plug into the court consistently.
I think most people, the only time they really pay attention is when a judge retires and then the president appoints somebody new, and then you go through that whole fight in the Senate. It is kind of interesting theater, but that's pretty much the only time I guess people know what's going on up there, right?
Well, that's right. I think more people are paying attention to Justice John Paul Stevens right now than he's sort of publicly, will he go, won't he go, than ever paid attention to him in the 3 decades that he's been on the court. So it's kind of interesting.
How did you get started covering the Supreme Court? I know you did it for the New York Times for many years. Was it always an interest of you to cover the courts?
Yes. Well, government generally has always been of interest to me, and I started out as a political reporter. I covered the state legislature in New York, and I covered Congress, and so the court beat came open and came along, and I liked it so much that I just stuck with it for a whole long time.
Well, what is the day like when you're covering a Supreme Court day? I mean, you go in, I guess, in the morning, and do you literally watch a case, or how do you go about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it can differ from one day to another because the court has a certain rhythm. They'll hear cases Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for 2 consecutive weeks or 2 weeks out of a month. So it kind of depends where they are in their cycle. But if, for instance, it's a kind of a busy spring day, so you go into the courtroom at 10 o'clock, and if they have opinions to announce in cases that they've already heard, the author of the opinion will describe it, in living color on the bench, and that's very interesting because the justice will emphasize what he or she thinks is the most important part of the opinion, so they try never to miss that. And then they will go right into the arguments of the day, usually 2 arguments in the morning. Once in a while, if there are an argument in the afternoon, not too often, each argument lasts an hour, half hour per side. Actually, but a lot of the reporter's work is homework, is reading the briefs and keeping track of the cases, because to go into a Supreme Court argument without having read the briefs and really knowing the case is like, walking into somebody else's country where you don't speak the language. So the homework part of it was something I really paid attention to.
And by the time a case gets there, obviously, it's been through 3 or 4 levels, so it's really come down to a very finite point at that point, isn't it, when it gets to the Supreme Court, what they're deciding on?
That's usually true, yes. And usually that point would be a point of law that the lower courts are in disagreement over. Mm-hmm. And that would be the main reason the court took the case in the first place. The justices have essentially complete discretion over which cases they choose to hear, and they get about 8,000 petitions a year, and they only take about 70. So that less than 1% actually get heard. And so the main criterion that they apply is we want to make sure that the law means the same thing in the 11th Circuit in Florida as it does in the 2nd Circuit in New York. And so when there's a conflict in the lower courts, that's the case that they're likely to accept.
What kind of access do you have as a reporter, Linda? I mean, do you ever have a chance to go one-on-one, or is it pretty tightly controlled?
It's pretty tightly controlled. I mean, you can had access to them in the sense that, if I asked to make an appointment to speak to one of them, I could. Mm-hmm. But it's with an understanding that they're not going to tell you any inside information. That is to say, they're not going to tell you what a reporter would really like to know, what's going on behind the scenes.
Right.
So the interaction, was always pleasant and interesting, but not necessarily, all that insightful.
Well, you're going to be talking next week on the 14th here in Sarasota, one of the most renowned cases, maybe the top 5 of all time that the Supreme Court decided on back in the early 70s, the Roe versus Wade case. Of course, you covered a lot of that. Give a little synopsis, if you would, what you're going to talk about next week.
Right. Well, I actually was not at the court back in 1973 when the court decided Roe. But what I'm going to be talking about is framed by a book that I and my co-author, Reva Siegel, who is a professor at Yale Law School, have just finished. The book's not quite out yet. It won't be out till June. But it's called Before Roe against Wade. And what we've tried to do is reconstruct the decade or so before the court issued its ruling that there's a constitutional right to abortion. Because we feel that it's kind of a lost decade. People have been so focused on the court's ruling that they don't know where it came from. They don't know what was happening in the country with respect to abortion leading into the case, what was the debate, who was saying what were doctors and lawyers saying, what were religious people saying, what were feminists saying, what were anti-feminists saying. So we have a collection of documents that we found in various archives and have annotated and arranged and explained that we hope will give people a better handle on where the dispute that has been going on now for decades over the right to abortion, where that came from and where it was anchored in American society.
Do you think it's a misunderstood case? I mean, everybody that debates it, whether they know what they're talking about exactly or not, uses that term. Do you think it's misunderstood what actually came out of that case by most people?
Yes. Well, for instance, there's one kind of narrative that says, the court decided this case. It landed like a bombshell on an unwary country that wasn't prepared for it. Well, that's really not true because there were, dozens of challenges to abortion laws all around the country in the early 1970s. Because abortion, of course, until a reform movement started in the late 60s, was illegal everywhere in the country. So Roe against Wade just happened to be the case that got to the court first. But it was not unique. It reflected a lot of agitation over abortion, and there were actions in state legislatures and big expectation in the country that something was changing and that the regime of criminal abortion laws that permitted abortion only to save a woman's life were on the way out. So that's one kind of historical correction. But on the other hand, some people take the view that, well, everything was changing in the country in the legislative and political process, and if only the court had stayed its hand and not jumped into this dispute, change would have happened anyway, but it would have been anchored much more firmly in the political process and not imposed by federal judges. And we think that's also incorrect because there was a raging debate, and reform, even in what you might think of as the blue states like New York, was kind of hanging by a thread and really was not spreading through the legislative process because of a big pushback, a big reaction. So both of the ways that we tend to think about how the case came about are not actually historically correct.
A debate that has been going on for about 37 years, and it will continue to go on, whatever side of the issue you're on, but it is a fascinating thing to read about and hear about. I'm sure the people down here are going to be interested in asking you questions. I hope you're prepared, Linda. There's a very active group down here at the Forum Truth Series.
I am ready.
And if you want tickets, we invite people just go to forumtruth.org or call 349-8350. Linda, appreciate you taking a few minutes to join us. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday night. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks a lot, Doug.